The winter of 1935 descended upon Harlem with a particular cruelty. Snow gathered in the gutters of Lenox Avenue, turning gray within hours from the endless stream of automobile exhaust and coal smoke that hung perpetually over the neighborhood. On the evening of January 17th, around 8:30, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Men walked quickly along the sidewalks, collars turned up against the wind, their breath visible in clouds before them. Women clutched their coats tight, hurrying between the warmth of storefronts and the relative shelter of apartment building doorways. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson stood outside Small's Paradise at the corner of 7th Avenue and 135th Street, wearing a gray wool overcoat and a fedora pulled low against the cold. He was 48 years old then, lean and composed, his face bearing the particular stillness that comes from having survived decades in an environment where visible emotion could prove fatal. Small's Paradise was a legitimate establishment, a jazz club where Duke Ellington had performed, where the waiters danced while carrying trays, where both black and white patrons came to hear music that existed nowhere else in the world. Johnson had no ownership stake in the club, but his presence there was understood by everyone in the neighborhood to represent a certain form of protection from the various predatory forces that might otherwise destroy a black-owned business in 1935 Harlem. The neighborhood surrounding Small's Paradise represented the densest concentration of African Americans anywhere in the United States. Over 200,000 people lived in an area covering less than 1 square mile, packed into tenements where families of 6 or 7 shared 3 rooms, where tuberculosis remained endemic, where infant mortality rates exceeded those of any comparable white neighborhood by factors that contemporary public health officials found difficult to explain without acknowledging the structural conditions they preferred to ignore. The official police presence in Harlem consisted primarily of white officers from outside the neighborhood, men who viewed their assignment not as community service, but as occupation duty in hostile territory. Officer Thomas Callahan had been assigned to the 32nd Precinct for 11 months. He was 32 years old, originally from the Woodlawn section of the Bronx. The son of an Irish immigrant who had worked on the docks until a loading accident left him permanently disabled. Callahan had joined the police force in 1928, during the final prosperous years before the economic collapse, and he had spent his career learning a particular approach to law enforcement that was common among white officers in black neighborhoods during this period. This approach rested on the assumption that visible dominance, the public demonstration of authority, prevented disorder more effectively than any actual investigation of crime or service to residents. On this particular evening, Callahan was walking his beat along 7th Avenue when he observed Johnson standing outside Small's Paradise. The exact sequence of what followed has been documented through multiple witness statements collected later by community organizations, though official police records from that night contain significant omissions. Callahan approached Johnson directly, crossing the sidewalk with the deliberate stride of someone intending to establish control of a situation before any conversation began. Johnson turned slightly at Callahan's approach, but did not move otherwise. The officer stopped approximately 3 feet away, close enough that his physical presence constituted a form of pressure. Several pedestrians slowed their walking, not stopping completely, but reducing their pace enough to remain within hearing distance. In Harlem in 1935, any interaction between police and residents carried the potential for violence, and witnesses understood that their presence might prevent escalation, or at least ensure that what happened would be remembered accurately. Callahan demanded identification. Johnson reached slowly into his coat pocket and produced a small leather wallet, extracting a card that listed his name and address. The officer examined it with exaggerated care, holding it close to his face in the inadequate streetlight, then asked Johnson to explain his business standing outside the club. Johnson replied that he was waiting for an associate. Callahan asked the name of this associate. Johnson declined to provide it. The refusal represented a critical moment. In the power dynamics that governed police interactions in Harlem, white officers expected immediate compliance with any request, regardless of its legal basis or relevance to actual law enforcement. The expectation was not merely professional, but racial, an assumption that black residents had no right to privacy, no legitimate reason to decline any question, no standing to determine the boundaries of an interaction with authority. When Johnson refused to name his associate, he was asserting a boundary that Callahan found intolerable. The officer stepped closer. His voice rose enough that witnesses later described being able to hear him clearly despite the street noise. He informed Johnson that he was acting suspiciously, that known criminals frequented this area, that failure to cooperate with police questioning could itself constitute grounds for arrest. The specific language he used included a racial slur that was common in police vocabulary during this period, but which witnesses later refused to repeat in their written statements, referring to it only as the usual language these officers use. Johnson did not respond. His face showed no reaction to the insult, no anger, no fear, no visible emotion of any kind. He simply stood in place, his hands now clearly visible at his sides, his posture neither aggressive nor submissive, but merely present. This stillness seemed to irritate Callahan more than any argument might have done. The officer continued speaking, his voice growing louder, informing Johnson that he had grounds to take him to the precinct for questioning, that he could hold him overnight if he chose, that Johnson's reputation was known to the police and that this alone justified additional scrutiny. Several aspects of this confrontation require understanding within their historical context. First, Johnson's reputation was indeed known to the police, but not in the simple way Callahan suggested. Johnson had been arrested multiple times during the 1920s, primarily on weapons charges and gambling-related offenses, but he had served relatively little time in prison because prosecutors consistently found their cases weakened by witnesses who refused to testify or evidence that somehow became unavailable. By 1935, he had emerged as a significant figure in Harlem's informal economy, the network of numbers operations, policy banks, and other enterprises that existed in the margins between legal business and criminal activity. The numbers game, as it was known, represented the primary form of gambling available to working-class black residents during this period. Players would bet small amounts, often as little as a penny or a nickel, on a three-digit number derived from various sources, including stock market figures or horse racing results. The odds of winning were approximately 1,000 to 1, but the payoff was 600 to 1, with the difference representing profit for the operators. This enterprise employed thousands of people across Harlem as runners, collectors, and bookkeepers, providing income in a neighborhood where legitimate employment opportunities remained severely restricted by racial discrimination. The white-dominated organized crime syndicates that controlled much of New York's illegal economy had been attempting to take over Harlem's numbers operations since the early 1930s. This effort involved both violence and collaboration with police, who could selectively enforce gambling laws to destroy black-operated banks while allowing white-controlled operations to function without interference. Johnson's position in this environment was complex. He was neither simply a criminal nor simply a businessman, but rather a figure who had learned to navigate the contradictions of an economic system that simultaneously criminalized black enterprise and denied black access to legitimate capital and markets. When Callahan threatened arrest, he was not primarily concerned with enforcing gambling laws. Rather, He was asserting the power of white authority to disrupt black life at will, to remind residents that they existed at the sufferance of a police force that owed them no accountability. The threat of arrest meant potential violence during transportation to the precinct, meant hours or days in holding cells where assaults by guards went uninvestigated, meant the loss of whatever employment a person held, since few employers would tolerate unexplained absences, meant legal fees for defense, even if charges were eventually dropped. Johnson understood all of this with perfect clarity. He also understood something that Callahan apparently did not, that this confrontation was occurring in public, on a well-traveled street, observed by dozens of witnesses who would remember every detail. Rather than respond to the officer's provocations, Johnson simply nodded once and began walking away, moving slowly south along 7th Avenue toward 134th Street. The movement was not flight. He did not hurry or show any sign of fear, but rather a deliberate withdrawal from a situation that offered no productive outcome. Callahan shouted after him to stop, to return, threatening arrest for failure to comply with a lawful order. Johnson continued walking. The officer did not pursue him. This detail is significant because it reveals the actual legal basis for the confrontation. There was none. Callahan had no legitimate cause to detain Johnson, no specific violation to cite, no grounds for arrest that would survive even the minimal scrutiny of a desk sergeant at the precinct. The entire interaction had been an exercise in establishing dominance, and Johnson's calm withdrawal had transformed it into a public demonstration of that dominance, failing to achieve its intended effect. The witnesses who had slowed to observe the confrontation now dispersed, continuing to their destinations with the particular alertness that characterized life in a neighborhood under occupation. They understood what they had seen, not a victory exactly, but a refusal to participate in the expected performance of submission. This refusal would be discussed in barbershops and beauty parlors, in churches and social clubs, adding to the accumulated stories about Johnson that shaped his reputation in the community. Johnson walked the 3 blocks to his apartment on 134th Street without looking back. The building was a 5-story brownstone that had been subdivided into smaller units during the 1920s when Harlem's population had exploded beyond the capacity of its housing stock. He climbed to the 3rd floor and entered a 4-room apartment that he shared with no one. The furnishings were modest but carefully maintained: a sofa upholstered in dark fabric, a wooden dining table with 4 chairs, a radio in a wooden cabinet, a bookshelf containing both popular novels and volumes on history and economics. The apartment's most notable feature was its lack of ostentation. Unlike the stereotypical images of gangster luxury that dominated popular imagination during this period, Johnson's living space suggested someone whose power came from sources other than the display of wealth. He removed his coat and hat, hanging them carefully in a small closet. He poured himself a glass of water from a pitcher in the kitchen and sat at the dining table, not drinking immediately, but simply sitting in stillness. This moment of withdrawal, of sitting alone in a quiet room after a public humiliation, represents the critical transformation point in narratives of this type. The anger from such encounters, the rage at being subjected to baseless harassment, at being addressed with slurs, at being threatened with violence simply for existing in public space, could manifest in immediate retaliation. But Johnson had learned over decades that immediate response rarely changed underlying conditions. The individual officer was merely a symptom of a system that required more sophisticated opposition. The system in question operated through several interlocking mechanisms. First, the police department itself maintained an explicitly racial hierarchy in which white officers held complete authority over black neighborhoods while facing minimal accountability for their actions. Complaints against officers were investigated by other officers, usually from the same precinct, and were almost never sustained regardless of the evidence. Second, the political structure of New York City in 1935 depended on the support of white ethnic voting blocs. Irish, Italian, Jewish communities that had themselves faced discrimination but had achieved sufficient political power to demand representation and patronage. Black voters represented a smaller percentage of the electorate and were largely excluded from the patronage system that distributed city jobs and contracts. Third, the economic isolation of Harlem meant that white-owned businesses and white-controlled criminal enterprises extracted wealth from the neighborhood while returning minimal investment to it. Rents were higher in Harlem than in comparable white neighborhoods, but building maintenance was worse. Grocers charged more for lower-quality goods. Legitimate businesses refused to provide services or credit to black customers on terms comparable to those offered to whites. This combination of political exclusion, economic exploitation, and police occupation created a system that was self-reinforcing. Each element supported the others, making piecemeal reform extremely difficult. Johnson understood that challenging this system required building power that could not be easily suppressed by individual acts of police violence. Such power needed to be economic, political, and social simultaneously. It needed to be distributed across enough people that removing any single individual would not destroy it. And it needed to be defensible through mechanisms that the existing power structure would find difficult to directly attack without revealing its own corruption. Over the next week, Johnson held a series of meetings in various locations across Harlem. The first occurred 2 days after the confrontation with Callahan, in the back room of a pharmacy on Lenox Avenue owned by a man named Samuel Carter. Carter was 63 years old, a licensed pharmacist who had graduated from Howard University in 1898 and had operated his business in Harlem since 1919. His pharmacy served as an informal community center where residents could cash checks, receive mail, leave messages for one another, and gather information about jobs and housing. Carter held no official position in any organization, but his business and his reputation made him a natural source of authority in the neighborhood. Johnson explained the encounter with Callahan in precise detail, including the exact language used, the presence of witnesses, and the officer's failure to pursue when Johnson walked away. Carter listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a small pad of paper. When Johnson finished, Carter asked whether this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern. Johnson explained that Callahan had been assigned to the 32nd Precinct for nearly a year and that complaints about his conduct had been increasing during that time. He mentioned specific incidents: a young man beaten during a stop on 132nd Street, a woman arrested for disorderly conduct after arguing about a traffic ticket, a shopkeeper threatened with business license revocation after refusing to pay for protection. Carter's question about patterns was crucial because it framed the situation not as a personal grievance, but as a systematic problem requiring a systematic response. Individual complaints against police officers almost never produced results, but documented patterns of misconduct could be leveraged into pressure on higher authorities. This required collecting testimony, verifying details, and building a record that could withstand skeptical examination. The second meeting occurred at the Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street, in the office of the pastor, Adam Clayton Powell, Sr. Powell was one of the most influential religious leaders in Harlem, presiding over a congregation of over 10,000 members. His church operated schools, employment services, soup kitchens, and other programs that addressed the practical needs of a community largely abandoned by municipal services. Powell himself was 69 years old, a figure of immense moral authority who had spent decades advocating for civil rights and economic justice, while maintaining relationships with white political leaders who respected his ability to mobilize voters. Johnson's meeting with Powell focused on the political dimensions of police accountability. Powell explained that the mayor's office was currently sensitive to criticism about police conduct because several high-profile incidents in other neighborhoods had generated newspaper coverage. A white woman had been accidentally shot during a raid in the Bronx. A prominent businessman had been roughed up during a traffic stop in Queens. These incidents created a brief window during which complaints from Harlem might receive more serious attention than usual, provided they were presented with sufficient documentation and community backing. Powell agreed to allow his church to serve as a collection point for written complaints about Officer Callahan's conduct. He would assign 2 members of his staff to interview residents who had experienced or witnessed misconduct, documenting each incident with dates, locations, and the names of any witnesses who were willing to be identified. This documentation would form the basis for a formal complaint to the police commissioner, signed by Powell and other prominent community leaders, demanding an investigation into Callahan's fitness to serve. The third meeting took place in the basement of a fraternal organization called the Prince Hall Masons, a historically black Masonic order that maintained a lodge on 7th Avenue. Present at this meeting were approximately 15 men representing various elements of Harlem's informal economy: numbers, bankers, policy operators, small business owners, whose enterprises existed in the gray areas of licensing and regulation. These men collectively employed hundreds of people and controlled significant financial resources, though their businesses were vulnerable to police harassment and selective enforcement. Johnson proposed a coordinated response to police extortion. Many of the men at the meeting had been approached by officers demanding regular payments in exchange for not interfering with their operations. These demands had increased recently, apparently driven by pressure from white criminal syndicates who wanted to use police power to eliminate black competition in the numbers game and other enterprises. Johnson suggested that instead of each operator dealing with these demands individually, they should pool resources to fund a legal defense fund and to support a coordinated refusal to pay. The risk in this strategy was obvious. Refusing to pay protection money invited police raids, arrests, and potential violence. However, Johnson argued that the current situation was unsustainable anyway. The payments were increasing, and compliance only encouraged further demands. Moreover, the white syndicates would eventually move to take over, regardless of whether individual operators cooperated with police extortion. A coordinated stand, particularly if combined with public pressure through church leaders and documentation of police misconduct, might shift the political calculation. It would demonstrate that Harlem's residents could not be easily divided and exploited, that attacking the informal economy would require such obvious and sustained use of force that it would generate political costs for the mayor and police commissioner. Not everyone at the meeting agreed immediately. Several operators argued that confronting police power directly was suicidal, that the better strategy was accommodation and negotiation. Others pointed out that white political allies who might otherwise support reform efforts would distance themselves if those efforts appeared connected to gambling and numbers operations. Johnson acknowledged these concerns, but emphasized that the various elements of community resistance needed to support one another even if they maintained public separation. The church-led complaint process could proceed independently while the economic operators quietly coordinated their response to extortion demands. The two efforts would reinforce each other without requiring explicit connection. Over the following 2 weeks, 3 significant developments occurred. First, The Abyssinian Baptist Church collected written statements from 47 residents describing incidents involving Officer Callahan. These ranged from verbal harassment to physical assault, with multiple accounts of Callahan demanding money from street vendors and threatening arrest if they refused. The statements were compiled into a document of nearly 30 pages, each incident dated and witnessed, the whole thing notarized and submitted to the police commissioner's office with a cover letter signed by Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and 6 other prominent clergy members. Second, the numbers operators who had attended the basement meeting implemented a coordinated stoppage of protection payments to police officers in the 32nd Precinct. This action was not announced publicly, but became evident through its effects. Within days, police began conducting raids on policy locations, arresting runners and seizing betting slips. However, the arrests generated unexpected consequences because the defense fund that Johnson had proposed allowed for immediate legal representation. Attorneys appeared at arraignments, demanded probable cause hearings, questioned the legality of searches, and generally created enough procedural complexity that prosecutors found themselves overwhelmed with cases they were unprepared to pursue with actual rigor. Third, information began circulating in Harlem about Officer Callahan's personal circumstances. He was married with 2 children, living in a rented house in Woodlawn. His wife did not work outside the home. His police salary was $65 per week, which was adequate for basic expenses but left little surplus. He had a brother who operated a small grocery store in the Bronx, a business that was struggling during the ongoing economic depression. These details became known through the informal intelligence networks that existed in every community. Conversations between domestic workers, observations by delivery drivers, information shared across the ethnic boundaries that supposedly divided the city's working class. The relevance of this information was that it revealed Callahan's vulnerability. He was not wealthy, not politically connected in any significant way, not protected by family influence or personal relationships with powerful figures. He was simply a working-class Irish American who had obtained a position of authority and was using that authority to supplement his income through extortion and to express the racial hostilities that he had learned growing up in segregated neighborhoods. If pressure could be applied effectively, he had no resources to resist beyond his police uniform. On February 3rd, Officer Callahan failed to report for his assigned shift at the 32nd Precinct. The precinct captain initially assumed he was ill and made no particular note of the absence. When Callahan again failed to appear on February 4th and did not respond to telephone calls to his home, the captain sent 2 officers to his residence in Woodlawn to check on his welfare. Callahan's wife reported that he had left the house on the morning of February 2nd, saying he needed to take care of some business before his shift. He had not returned home, and she had not heard from him since. A missing person report was filed, triggering a search that included inquiries at hospitals, morgues, and known associates. Callahan's brother reported that he had not seen or heard from him. Other officers from the 32nd Precinct were questioned about whether Callahan had mentioned any personal problems or concerns. None reported anything unusual. The investigation expanded to include interviews with Harlem residents, though these interviews produced no useful information, or rather, they produced the carefully uniform response that characterizes communities that have learned not to cooperate with police inquiries. The formal investigation proceeded for several weeks without developing any significant leads. Callahan's disappearance became a minor newspaper story, generally framed as evidence of the dangers facing police officers in neighborhoods like Harlem. Editorial writers used the incident to argue for increased police presence and tougher enforcement, apparently without recognizing the irony of these recommendations. Within the police department itself, Callahan's disappearance generated various theories. that he had been killed by criminals, that he had fled debts or personal problems, that he had simply abandoned his family to start a new life elsewhere. What actually happened to Officer Thomas Callahan has never been definitively established. No body was ever found. No credible witnesses to any violence against him ever came forward. No evidence of him starting a new life in another location was ever discovered. The historical record contains only his absence, which began on February the 2nd, 1935, and continued permanently. The uncertainty surrounding his fate is significant because it highlights the limits of documentation in marginalized communities during this period. Much of what occurred in Harlem was deliberately unrecorded by residents who had learned that documentation could be used against them, by police who preferred operational flexibility to procedural accountability, by city officials who found it convenient to remain ignorant of conditions they had no intention of addressing. The gaps in the historical record are themselves evidence of the power dynamics that shaped daily life. What can be documented with certainty is the effect of Callahan's disappearance on the broader situation. Within days, several officers from the 32nd Precinct began refusing assignments in Harlem, citing concerns for their safety. The precinct captain requested additional manpower, arguing that the neighborhood had become too dangerous for standard patrols. This request triggered a bureaucratic review that brought attention to the complaint documentation that the Abyssinian Baptist Church had submitted. The police commissioner's office, already sensitive to criticism about police conduct, found itself facing uncomfortable questions about why an officer with 47 documented complaints against him had remained on duty in the same neighborhood for nearly a year. The commissioner ordered a formal internal investigation, assigning it to officers from outside the 32nd Precinct to avoid conflicts of interest. This investigation reviewed the complaint documentation and interviewed many of the witnesses. The resulting report confirmed a pattern of misconduct, though it stopped short of directly attributing Callahan's disappearance to retaliation for that misconduct. Instead, the report noted that officers who engaged in systematic harassment and extortion created conditions that undermined public safety for everyone, including the officers themselves. The practical outcome was a reassignment of personnel at the 32nd Precinct. Several officers known for particularly aggressive conduct toward residents were transferred to other assignments. New directives were issued regarding the documentation of stops and searches, the handling of complaints, and the supervision of officers working in communities with high rates of tension between police and residents. These reforms were modest and were not fully implemented, but they represented a shift from the previous policy of ignoring misconduct entirely. More significantly, the incident changed the calculation of power in Harlem. The coordinated resistance that Johnson had helped organize, the documentation of police misconduct by church leaders, the legal defense fund supporting arrested numbers operators, the collective refusal to pay extortion, had demonstrated that the community possessed resources that could not be easily suppressed. Individual acts of resistance could be crushed, individual leaders could be arrested or driven out, but a coordinated effort involving multiple institutions and constituencies proved much more difficult to defeat. The numbers operators who had participated in the coordinated stoppage of protection payments found that police pressure on their operations decreased somewhat after Callahan's disappearance. Raids continued, but with less frequency and more attention to actual legal procedures. The shift was not dramatic. Harlem remained heavily policed, and harassment remained common, but the calculation had changed slightly. Officers understood that aggressive misconduct might generate consequences beyond what they had previously assumed. Samuel Carter, the pharmacist whose back room had hosted one of the initial planning meetings, began documenting police misconduct on an ongoing basis. He kept a ledger in which he recorded incidents reported to him by customers and neighbors, creating a systematic record that could be used to identify patterns and support future complaints. Other business owners adopted similar practices, understanding that documentation represented a form of power in a system that preferred to operate without accountability. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. used the successful submission of the complaint documentation to strengthen the Abyssinian Baptist Church's role as an advocate for the community. He established a permanent committee to monitor police conduct, collect complaints, and maintain relationships with city officials who might be responsive to concerns about civil rights violations. This committee would eventually be expanded by his son, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who would use it as part of the foundation for his own political career representing Harlem in the U.S. Congress. Johnson himself maintained the networks he had developed during the organizing effort. The meetings that had begun as a response to one officer's misconduct evolved into an ongoing structure for coordinating action on various issues affecting the community. When white criminal syndicates attempted to take over numbers operations, the coordinated resistance they encountered was more organized and more sustained than it would have been without the relationships built during the Callahan incident. When the police department attempted to crack down on specific forms of informal economic activity, community leaders could respond with documentation, legal challenges, and political pressure in ways that individual operators could not. The transformation this incident produced was not primarily in visible structures or formal institutions, though those elements were present. Rather, it was in the understanding among Harlem residents that power could be built through coordination, that documentation and organization could challenge the arbitrary exercise of authority, that the various elements of community life, churches, businesses, informal economic networks, could support one another even when they maintained public separation. This understanding would prove crucial in the years that followed. The 1935 Harlem riot, which occurred later that same year in March, began as a response to rumors of police brutality and reflected the accumulated rage at systematic mistreatment. The organizing structures that had developed around the Callahan incident helped channel some of that energy into more sustainable forms of resistance. When the Mayor's Commission on Conditions in Harlem issued its report in 1936, documenting the systematic discrimination and exploitation that characterized life in the neighborhood, the evidence it relied upon included documentation that community organizations had been collecting using methods developed during the complaint process against Callahan. Johnson continued to operate in Harlem's informal economy for another 2 decades, eventually becoming one of the most significant figures in the neighborhood's complex power structure. His influence derived not from violence, though he certainly employed violence when he deemed it necessary, but from his ability to build and maintain coalitions, to understand systematic, rather than merely individual power, to think strategically about long-term positioning rather than immediate confrontation. The encounter with Callahan in January 1935 exemplified this approach, demonstrating how apparent weakness could be transformed into coordinated strength through patience, organization, and attention to the actual mechanics of power. The question of what happened to Officer Thomas Callahan remains historically unresolved. The official investigation concluded without identifying any suspects or determining a cause for his disappearance. His family eventually declared him legally dead, though this declaration was based on the passage of time rather than any evidence of his actual death. Rumors circulated in Harlem for years afterward, though these rumors were contradictory and unreliable. Some claimed he had been killed and disposed of in the Hudson River, others that he had been paid to leave the city and never return, still others that he had simply fled in fear and started over somewhere under a new identity. The uncertainty itself served a purpose. It left open the possibility that challenging police misconduct might carry consequences that the police department could not prevent or avenge. This possibility did not eliminate police harassment in Harlem. That would have required fundamental changes in the political and economic structures that made such harassment profitable and professionally advantageous for officers. But it did introduce an element of calculation where previously there had been only impunity. More broadly, the incident illustrated several principles that would recur in struggles for civil rights and community power throughout the 20th century. First, that individual acts of resistance, however courageous, rarely produce sustainable change unless they connect to broader organizing efforts. Second, that effective organizing requires coalition building across different constituencies, religious institutions, business owners, informal economic operators, working-class residents, each contributing different resources and perspectives. Third, that challenging systematic power requires systematic responses, documentation, legal challenges, economic coordination, political pressure, applied persistently over time rather than through single dramatic confrontations. Fourth, that power is ultimately relational and depends on perception as much as force. The police department's power in Harlem rested on residents' belief that resistance was futile, that officers could act with impunity, that individual complaints would be ignored and collective action would be crushed. Challenging those beliefs did not require matching the police department's capacity for violence, but rather demonstrating that organized resistance could impose costs and generate consequences that made casual brutality less attractive than more measured conduct. The legacy of this incident extended beyond Harlem itself. The organizing techniques developed in response to Callahan's harassment were shared with activists in other communities facing similar conditions. The documentation methods, pioneered by Samuel Carter and institutionalized through the Abyssinian Baptist Church's Monitoring Committee, became models for civil rights organizations in later decades. The understanding that economic power, political pressure, and legal challenges needed to work together rather than separately informed strategies from the Montgomery bus boycott to the Fair Housing Act campaigns. In the immediate aftermath of Callahan's disappearance, life in Harlem continued with its characteristic complexity. The numbers game persisted as a major employer and source of community capital, though with more sophisticated organization to resist takeover attempts. Police harassment continued, though officers were marginally more careful about generating documented complaints. Economic exploitation persisted, though small victories in rent strikes and consumer boycotts demonstrated that coordinated action could produce limited improvements. Johnson himself never spoke publicly about the Callahan incident. In the decades that followed, as his reputation grew and various writers and journalists sought to document his life, he maintained strict silence about events that could not be verified through official records. This silence was strategic. It avoided creating evidence that could be used in criminal prosecutions, and it maintained the ambiguity that made his power difficult for authorities to directly challenge. What is known about his role in organizing the response to Callahan comes from the testimony of others who participated, filtered through years of memory and the inevitable distortions of oral history. The historical significance of the incident lies not in its drama. There was no climactic confrontation, no public triumph, no moment of clear victory, but in its demonstration of how power operates and can be challenged in communities that lack access to formal political and legal institutions. The transformation from individual humiliation to collective action, from immediate anger to strategic organization, from personal grievance to systematic analysis, represented a form of power that authorities found more difficult to suppress than any individual act of resistance. By 1968, when Johnson died of congestive heart failure at the age of 81, Harlem had changed substantially from the neighborhood he had known in 1935. The civil rights movement had achieved formal legal victories that eliminated official segregation, though economic inequality and residential segregation persisted through other mechanisms. The police department had integrated, hiring black officers who brought different perspectives and accountability to law enforcement, though problems of brutality and harassment remained. The informal economy he had helped organize had evolved, sometimes in destructive directions, as heroin replaced the numbers game as a major source of illegal profit. But the understanding that power could be built through organization, that systematic problems required systematic responses, that different elements of a community could coordinate their resistance even while maintaining surface separation, these insights persisted. They were transmitted through the institutions that survived, through the stories that were remembered and retold, through the lived experience of people who had participated in that era of organizing and passed their knowledge to subsequent generations. The disappearance of Officer Thomas Callahan on February 2, 1935, remains unexplained. What is not mysterious is the transformation it catalyzed, the shift from isolated resistance to coordinated power, from accepting humiliation to building structures that could impose accountability, from understanding power as purely individual force to recognizing it as a systematic arrangement that could be challenged through systematic organization. This transformation occurred quietly, without headlines or dramatic pronouncements, but its effects shaped Harlem for decades to come.